Hello, reading friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann. This book was originally published in Germany in 2017, and it got an English translation in 2020 done by Ross Benjamin. So I don't know if you can see this cover that well because it's a black cover, but we have kind of a gesture there. Tyll by Daniel Kehlmann. This came on to my reading radar because this translation made the short list for the Booker International, this English translation that I read. So I decided to go ahead and get this one read because it sounded really intriguing to me. This is a historical fiction that it reads like a fantasy though, and I'll explain more as we go. But it is a historical fiction, and with historical fiction, I think it's often good to get settled where we are, when and where we are. The where we are, we're in the Holy Roman Empire. So if you're not familiar with that, it's not the Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire. That was an empire that existed in Central Europe for about 900 years, from the 900s. Late 900s until the early 1800s. So we are set in the Holy Roman Empire. The time that this book is set in is during the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War occurred from 1618 to 1648. The main character's name is actually Tyll Eulenspiegel, and this character appeared in, the German-speaking world in the Middle Ages, actually, in a chapbook, it was called. I looked that up. A chapbook is a book. It was kind of like a proto-paperback. It was like a cheap printing, like a little novella, cheap printing. And this character appears in legend as early as the Middle Ages, but our author here has set this character in this time frame of the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire. So the 30 Years' War was a very brutal and deadly war. It was a war of religion between Catholics and Protestants, and it was fought there in the Holy Roman Empire. So Tyll Eulenspiegel is a jester, so he is an entertainer. And so as this story opens, the story is not told linearly. So speaking of spoilers, I won't give away anything that I think would detract from a first-time reader's experience of this book, obviously. But the story is not told linearly. So the very first chapter kicks us off in basically the middle of Tyll's story. But it's at this... It sort of sets this magical tone that makes this historical fiction really feel like almost a fantasy. And so the very first scene is Tyll and his traveling companion Nellie, and then an older lady that's traveling with them. That we get to know all these characters eventually and how they all came together and why they're all traveling on the road together during this time. But they are in a village in the Holy Roman Empire that the war has not yet touched. So eventually in this book we see some pretty grim scenes of devastation and suffering as due to the war. But they are in a village that hasn't been touched by the war yet. Oh, I didn't mention the donkey. They're also traveling with a talking donkey. And the talking donkey, though, is actually ventriloquism, but because of the superstitions of the day, and this is what the author does really well in this book, is really puts us into this time. So even our main character Tyll is not like omniscient. Like he still, I think, looks out for the little people and things like that. He's not as unsophisticated as most of the villagers that they come across, but nevertheless, he also has this sort of superstition. But because the superstitions of the people, these people, they live in villages, they're very isolated, they don't see a lot of entertainers, and so little tricks, juggling and tightrope walking and things like that he does just amazes them. And then he gets them all, they're so carried away into another world by his performance, they do whatever he says. He eventually gets them to take off their shoes and start throwing their shoes, and then people get hit in the head with shoes and stuff, and then fights break out, and they skip town. So one thing Tyll Eulenspiegel learns how to do fairly early on in his traveling career is how to skip town quickly when things turn bad, because the entertainers are usually the first one that gets blamed for anything. Like if there's a fire, or if the crops go bad, or if there's a theft or a murder, they'll say that this stranger that was passing through is the one who caused it. So like I said, the chapters don't go in order, but eventually we do meet Tyll as a young boy. We do understand exactly how and why he began traveling, as well as Nellie, his traveling companion, and then eventually also the older lady and the donkey. So historical figures. There's a lot of actual historical figures that appear as characters in this book. One is King James, William Shakespeare, Princess Elizabeth Stuart, who is the daughter of King James. She ends up marrying Frederick V, and he was an Elector Palatine, which is, I guess, is a status in the Holy Roman Empire. Ultimately, he and she become the king and queen of Bohemia, but it only lasts a really short time, one brief winter, and so he is called the Winter King, and she is known as the Winter Queen. These are historical figures, and Tyll Eulenspiegel interacts with them. Well, he doesn't interact with Shakespeare and King James. That's Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James, meets them at some point. So it's I always think it's kind of cool in historical fiction to come across a fictionalized account of actual historical characters. There's actually many more in this novel. There's a poet, I think that's a real life person, Paul Fleming, I think it might be the name. Some scholars, but there's several other characters that I looked up. It's real handy to have your phone or internet connection around somewhere that you can, is this a real person? And you can look it up. Oh yeah, it actually was most of the time. So there's key scenes and quotes. So I mentioned that eventually we kind of learned to know why Nellie decided to travel with Tyll, and there's a quote around that. So I thought I would just read that. Let me just find it real quick, because to me it was really kind of a cool quote from her. Let me just find it real quick here. She's talking about she has to make a decision about whether or not to go with Tyll. If she doesn't go with him, she's going to have a certain life that she knows is mapped out for her. She's going to have to marry one of the neighborhood boys that she's already sort of been lined up with by the other villagers to marry, and she's going to have this certain life. But if she goes with Tyll, she's going to have a different life, and a life, although fraught with danger, with a lot more freedom. And she says, there are only a few moments when two things are possible, one path as much as another. Only a few moments you can decide. So this is actually also takes place in the very first chapter. Tyll meets a young girl in the crowd in this village with the shoes, and he says, come with us, you're one of us. He sees a kindred spirit in her. You're one of us. And she hesitates about whether or not she knows, like, the danger. If she goes, her life is taking a radical shift. And in your life, you do usually only have a few of these moments where everything pivots on a moment, on kind of a quick decision that you make, or an abrupt decision that you make, that your life would go in a completely different direction if you chose differently. And I just think that is so cool to think about. Then I just wanted to read another quote here that I thought was super cool. Let me find it real quick. This one is about Tyll's parents. So, the relationship, in addition to the superstitions and the religious prejudices, and there's witch burnings, there's this sort of Inquisition type stuff going on still. In addition to all this, we understand and we can get through this reading that, being placed into this time, that parents have a different relationship to their children because most of their children actually don't survive. And so there's a distance that we don't see in our culture here in the U.S. anyway. Usually today, we usually see a fairly close bond between parents and children from right off the get-go. This is not how it was during this era. And so it took me a while to even realize, are these his parents or are they just people he's living with? Because they treat him with such indifference. But this quote's actually a little bit different, but let me just get to the quote. Earlier was now, and now is now. And in the future, when everything is different and when there are different people and no one but God knows about him and Agneta and Klaus, his mother and father, and the mill anymore, then it will still be now. So I thought that was really cool because it is actually always now. So now is what is getting imprinted constantly. Now is now. And when an event occurred in the past, that moment was also now. And so it's now is now is now. And I just thought that was so cool to think about. Finally, there's one more quote I wanted to just sort of address because I thought it was such a cool thing. And let me get to it here. This is about his traveling life. On the other hand, he tells himself often, life simply leads you somewhere or other. If you weren't here, you would be elsewhere, and everything would be just as strange. So this is his sort of outlook on life, that if I wasn't here, I would be somewhere else, and life would be just as confusing and weird as it is there as it is here. And so he's really just enjoying the journey of his life. And that is really the ultimate sort of takeaway I got from this character. He does undergo a lot of, trials and tribulations. This is also the time when once you got old and couldn't do your job anymore, there wasn't a social safety net at all. So if you didn't have any family that was going to care for you at that point, just what was to become of you, right? And he sort of throws this to the wind, and he's given an opportunity to get a more settled and stable and more secure life, which he doesn't really that doesn't appeal to him so much. Other characters sometimes do. This is one of the codes of the traveling people. They group together and then they disperse. This was another kind of cool thing about this story, is that there's some people join their little entertainment troupe, musicians and others, balladeers and things, and then they disperse for one reason or another. But then you might see them again later in another village. You may come across them for some reason, for some way or another. So anyway, I enjoyed reading this historical fiction that really felt so magical and so much like a fantasy, but yet grounded in the real 30 Years' War, and also this character that's either couldn't really gather if it's a real person or if it was all this Tyll Eulenspiegel was always an imaginary sort of fictional character, maybe a little bit of both, appearing in these medieval sort of stories about this famous entertainer, jester. So I will leave the chat with that. My next chat is actually going to be The Caretakers of the Cosmos, Living Responsibly in an Unfinished World by Gary Lachman. I am almost finished with this, so I should have a chat up on this fairly soon. So until next time, take care.